Hey, Headwaters Church, thanks for coming back. It is the week of, what is this? Hey, Headwaters Church, thanks for coming back. We are in the midst of all kinds of discussions about reintegrating. What does it look like to come back together as a church? And what types of things do we need to implement to help those things go effectively and according with the state's guidelines on where we are in the midst of coronavirus? And one of the things that keeps coming up is doing away with handshakes. And people are suggesting all kinds of boring alternatives to the handshake. You know, just the wave or like tap somebody's foot. So I thought I'd just offer you a few other alternatives to the handshake. The theatrical bow. The Three Stooges. The chicken dance. The hip bump, the finger guns. If you want a variation, you can add a wink and some noise to it. Pew pew. The tip of the hat. On a side note, bring back the regular wearing of hats. Prayer hands. Instead of shaking hands, you place your right hand flat against someone's left hand. I might be losing sight of the purpose of this mental exercise. The chest bump. Hey, welcome to church. The fadeaway. The glasses waggle. The aircraft marshaller. Jazz hands. The Dougie. The MJ. The other MJ. Or you go with a combo of some sort. Waggle winking guns. On a side note, Waggle winking guns sounds like a struggling futuristic law firm that focuses on canine breeding disputes. Whatever handshake alternative you choose to employ, we'll be excited to welcome you back to church whenever we get to see you. Question number 14. Again, thanks for sticking with this catechism. We are close to 1/3 of the way through. And if you aren't paying attention, you may not have noticed, you basically have gotten 1/3 of the way through an introductory course on systematic theology. And theology is just the taking of what the Bible says and who God has revealed himself to be in his word and helping to inform a big picture of who God is and Christian doctrine. That's what systematic theology is trying to do. And in a lot of ways, that's what you're working through in this catechism. Simple, straightforward, but theological and biblically grounded nonetheless. So I encourage you, continue to work through, and it's going to get really good here in just a little bit as we turn the corner on this law-gospel relationship and we get to the Redeemer that is Christ. So I just encourage you to stick with it. It's been great so far. Thanks for sticking along. Question number 14. Question: did God create us unable to keep his law? Answer: no. But because of the disobedience of our first parents, Adam and Eve, all of creation is fallen. We are all born in sin and guilt, corrupt in our nature and unable to keep God's law. So we've made our way through those series of questions on the Ten Commandments, and then kind of we're hit in the face a little bit with this suggestion that no one can actually keep God's law. Here's the expectation as laid out in the Mosaic Law, and it's given to the nation of Israel, but no one's able to keep it, as we saw in question 13. Nobody can do this. And so as we look at that, we continue to tease out this law and specifically gospel distinction. We'll get to the gospel part of it in just a moment. Right now, we're kind of auguring down into the inability and teasing out, how are we made unable? What does that mean? How does that, our inability in the light of the law, how do we understand that? How can we apply that? And today, the question is, are we made unable to keep the law? And the answer comes back, no. No, we weren't made for this. We were made to be in communion with God. But because of Adam and Eve, and because of the sin that enters the world through them, We are passed on a sin nature. And you see in the verse there that's used by the Catechism for this question and answer, comes out of Romans chapter 5, a very straightforward but important verse to grapple with and understand. Starting in verse 12, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men, because all sinned. As we continue to tease out this relationship between us and the law, and we're continually met with the fact that all people sin, right? That was Romans 5. You find that very clearly in Romans 3 as well. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There's no limiting factor here. It's all people. There aren't some good ones and some bad ones. We are all the bad ones, unable to keep the law in the way that we should. And you see things like David in Psalm 51 admitting that I was conceived in iniquity. From the very first moment of his existence, before he was even born, he was in sin. You have tangible proof of this if you've ever been around a child under the age of 1. They know how to be selfish. No one has to teach them selfishness. It is immensely accessible for a baby to know how to be selfish. Now, if you were to try and ask your 1-year-old to be selfless, that's a difficult thing to teach an adult, much less a child. We have this ingrained into who we are. Sin has become so pervasive into the human condition, it's just part of our nature. We weren't created that way. But because of the sin of Adam and Eve, that has been passed down to all people. That sin nature is a part of what makes us human. Sin is a very human problem. What are we to do then? If we have this corrupt nature as a part of who we are, a defining characteristic of what it means to be human, how are we to apply this? This feels very, very bleak. And while it is, it's a continuation of the question from last week, question 13. There is immense hope here as well. So first, just a couple ways to apply this. First, we need to be reminded that we are not created for this brokenness. Adam and Eve were created in communion with God. And as you and I look out and we see the pervasive effects, the infection of sin that has spread through all of humanity, there's not one person that has gone untouched. Infection rate is 100%. And the conclusion of that infection is death. It is helpful. It is hopeful. It is a light of joy to be reminded we are not made for this. We are made to be in communion with God. And so when I think about applying the truth of our sin nature that's passed down to us from Adam and Eve, I have to be reminded that I wasn't made for a sin nature. And just in terms of tangible application, what are you to do with that? You're to yearn for heaven, to long to be in that state for which you were made, the end for which all things were created, to bring God glory and to be in communion with Him. We were not made for this brokenness. You should be yearning for heaven, knowing that we are broken in the midst of the temporal world that we live in, but longing for the eternal world where we get to be once again in proper communion with God. Second point of application: don't put too much hope in human effort. Human effort is limited by sin. There's none righteous, not one. There's nobody that you should expect to just be perfect and selfless all the time. Your spouse cannot live up to those expectations. And when you find sin in your spouse or somebody close to you, be reminded that there's also sin in you. Don't expect too much. Don't be surprised when sin rears its head. Of any person. Don't expect too much of your politicians. Don't expect too much of your heroes of the faith, of your pastors. They are all sinful, limited, broken. Don't expect too much. And as bleak and depressing as that may sound, the inability to expect and hope and count on human effort is given that much more relief when we turn to Christ and we find in Him a remedy that we could never offer for ourselves. As Jeremiah says, the heart is deceitful above all else. Who can trust it? That's the human condition. And when we finally come to grips with that, then the joy of finding Christ is that much greater. Did God create us unable to keep His law? No. But because of the disobedience of our first parents, Adam and Eve, all of creation has fallen. We are all born in sin and guilt, corrupt in our nature, and unable to keep God's law.